Okay, so let's go and write the actual code. We just need an empty file here for the header. Yes. Timer.h. Save. Okay, zoom it in and let's begin writing it. So, we need to create our guards first, of course. So if and def timer underline h. Excellent, and diff has been created. Define timer underline h, and let's go ahead and begin writing it. So this the timer class that we are about to create will be used for asynchronous code execution. All the variables here will be private by default, as they are usually in classes, and we will leave them as such, because we would not like anything to mess around with its inner workings. And that is one of the principles of object-oriented programming. To put it in short, like we are compartmentalizing our program, so to say. Okay, so let's type in class timer timer. Why are you doing this? Timer. Okay, guess I need to do that. Timer, right. And before that, I just neglected to include the two libraries which I have talked about in the very beginning. So include thread, and we will also need to include chrono. So include chrono. Fantastic. Let me just hit a space here for God knows what reasons. And let's go ahead and start configuring our private variables. There will be a good long list of them. So std thread. Now this is our thread for asynchronous execution. It creates a variable thread of type std thread from the thread library. We will use this variable if we want asynchronous code execution without blocking the main thread, and that will almost always be the case here. Okay, so next up we will need a boolean. Alive. Is it alive or not? Equals false. Too bad. So this will indicate the state of the timer, whether it is running or not, so that we can check from the program if the timer is running. Excellent, so I made a small mistake there. I'll just keep them in one line. So the next variable will be of long type. Call number equal to -1L. So this might be a little bit strange for you if you see this. So this will determine how many times, this particular variable, we will use it to determine how many times we would like to call a certain function. For example, attempt to send a mail 5 times, etc. -1L, well, -1 will be the default value. So yeah, we're not going to be doing pretty much anything with the -1 times. You're not going to do anything -1 times because it doesn't make much of a logical sense, but this is flexible and arbitrary, so we are defining this, and L stands for long, so that it does not become an int. So if you put a -1, it might become an int, and we place L for long, that it stands for long, so that it does not become an int, basically. We are also using the long type because the keylogger could run for a year, and we would like to be certain that an overflow will not happen. Okay, next up will be a variable for a similar purpose and of the same type. So again, long repeat count, and this shall equal to -1L. So here we will count the amount of times a certain function has been called, so -1L. Again, the same principle as with above. This is a long type, and -1, well, that's the default value, and L stands there to prevent the conversion to int. So this will simply count the amount of times a certain function has already been called, while the variable above call number will determine how many times do we want to call a function. So one is a counter and one is a set number. Now, okay, so just scrolling to the notes here. Down below, let's go ahead and type in std chrono milliseconds interval equals std chrono milliseconds 0. Excellent. So the variable interval of type chrono milliseconds, this one will represent an interval between function calls, and the default value will be 0. So the default interval between function calls is 0. Later on, of course, things can be done with that. Next one will be std : Now this is something new in C++11. Function void. Excellent. Okay, I'm pretty sure I made a mistake here. PTR. Let me just do a check here. Right. God. Void. There we go. So, this is a std : function is a new type in C++11 which can contain functions. This is rather similar to a pointer to a function. This part here that you see can accept a function that takes nothing and it does not return anything. And it was initialized to null PTR, which means that it does not point to any function at the moment. Null PTR is also a new concept in C++11. Before we used number 0, which is not really good due to the fact that it gets mixed up with int 0. So null PTR simply means it's pointing towards nothing. Excellent. Now let's go and jump into let's go ahead and start creating the methods here. So void sleep and run. Okay, there we go. So std, this thread : sleep for interval. So this thread indicates the current thread which created the timer object. Sleep _4 will pause or block. Well, same thing. I'm referring to the same thing. It will actually block the thread for a certain time interval. Down below, we will type in if alive. Oh my god. Alive if it lives. Function. Okay, so if alive, meaning if the timer is running, call the function from below. We specified the variable alive here. It's a bool. It's the default is false, but if the timer is running, this variable will be changed to true. So if alive, function, call this function below. Now this might be a strange thing to look at, like parentheses, parentheses. So this function will be a public method which will be explained down below, and it represents a function that we will need to call. If you are wondering why the double parentheses, well, first one calls the function called function. So this one, the first one, calls this function. Why is it called function? We could have named it tralala for all intents and purposes, but the name is function, so yeah. And the second one, what the second one does is that it will basically, the second one will call the function that this function returns. I know, it's a bit of a difficult concept to grasp. So we will call this function, it will return another function, and then the second parentheses will call that second function. A bit of a strange concept, but that is how it is with these things. Not much really that I can do about it. That's how things are, that's how they stand, that's how it is. Okay, so let's go down below. So next up will be void thread, like this. So this function, this is the function which will be passed to the thread, because we cannot tell the thread to do something 5 times or something like that. Rather, instead, we will pass this function, and in such a way, we will give ourselves a greater degree of control, like call sleep and run function 5 times. So just type in if, and we will use the variables from above. Call number equals infinite. The constant infinite will be defined down below, and we'll see what that is, what happens there. While alive, sleep and run. Great. Else, while count minus sleep and run. Okay, so if the call number is the same as infinite, as this variable, or well, if it is the same as the constant infinite, we will define the constant infinite down below. Let this happen. So while it is alive, please go ahead and do this. Else, while repeat count, so we are reducing the repeat count. Let's say that the repeat count is, for example, 10. Every positive number will evaluate to true. Once it becomes a 0, it will evaluate to false. So while true, this will happen. Once it becomes false, this will no longer happen. Anyway, we're going to go into the second section of this class, and we will see some of the functions that some of the methods that we will define there, and what we shall do with them in the follow-up tutorial.